war in the Pacific was rough, fast, and pushed state-of-the-art war technology to its absolute limits. With the tragic attack on Pearl Harbor and the follow-up battle for Midway, it became clear that the Pacific would be won through air superiority. At the start of the war, the infamous Japanese Zero would quickly become feared amongst Allied forces. Its speed and maneuverability made it a nightmare to engage with in standard dogfights. In the hands of a trained pilot, the Zero could also cause a devastating amount of damage to larger naval vessels, even if some unconventional tactics needed to be used. The Japanese Zero was used by the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1940 to 1945. Its name comes from the final digit of the year, 1940. Actually, the imperial year in Japan at the time was 2600. Either way, the name comes from the final digit of the year it entered service. It prioritized speed and agility with an empty weight of about 3,700 pounds versus the 5,800 pounds of the American Wildcat. It was thought that the long range and fast speed of the Zero would allow it to dominate the long open stretches of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Navy wanted a fighter that could reach speeds of 310 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and climb to 9,800 feet in 9.5 minutes. The Navy also requested that the Zero be kept to a minimal size so that more of the planes could be stowed in aircraft carriers. Initially, the companies Nakajima and Mitsubishi were tasked with the development of the Zero, but Nakajima considered the given requirements to be impossible, leaving Mitsubishi with a challenge of developing a tiny plane that could still have a respectable power output. In order to meet the given requirements, Mitsubishi incorporated every weight-saving measure it could. The aircraft was constructed mainly from a secret aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin. This metal was masterfully crafted to be extremely light, while still having the toughness to withstand most of the high-speed turns and maneuvers that take place during dogfights. An interesting fact is that this aluminum alloy was discovered by the United States upon capturing and reverse engineering wrecked Japanese Zeros. Now a form of the same alloy is used by the U.S. military to manufacture M16 rifles. It is also a common material used in competition yo-yos. While this aluminum alloy served its purpose of being light yet strong, it was also quite stiff and brittle. Planes needed to have a degree of flexibility in order to withstand the high gravity turns and twists that occur during flight. This was addressed with the application of a zinc chromate coating after fabrication, in an effort to minimize the weight of the craft. Mitsubishi did not include any armor protection for the pilot or engine. The Zero, for all intents and purposes, was a flying soda can.
It was found to have plenty of speed and maneuverability, but almost no protection for the pilots. It wasn't to be expected that the Japanese warlords would care much about the safety of the men who fight the battle. Human lives mean very little to them, even the lives of their own people.
Besides a lack of armor, the Zero also did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. If the Zero was hit and started to leak fuel, it would continue to leak until it was empty.
I'll warrant you never saw a gas tank treated like this before.
This created logistical issues for pilots returning after dogfights and created an obvious fire hazard. The Zero was made with only a few things in mind: speed, agility, and range. The lightweight of the Zero allowed it to accelerate much faster than its counterparts, but perhaps more importantly, it gave the Zero an extremely low stalling speed of 69 miles per hour. For comparison, the stalling speed of the American Wildcat was 100 miles per hour, while the upgraded Hellcat stalled at about 84 miles per hour. Being able to fly at slower speeds means a plane can make sharper turns and tighter maneuvers. This made the Zero an absolute terror in dogfights. There ended up being several variants of the Japanese Zero. The one most commonly witnessed in the Pacific theater would have been the Zero Model 21. This version was specifically designed to be packed into aircraft carriers by having folding wingtips. This Zero used a 950 horsepower Nakajima Sake engine. This radial engine had 14 cylinders and a displacement of 27.9 liters. There is currently only one operational Zero in the world that still uses a restored Sake engine, currently held at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California. Most Zeros seen in air shows use completely different American-made engines. The Model 21 Zero had an extraordinary range of over 1,600 miles, nearly twice the range of the American Wildcat. Because of this extreme range, Japan could launch more attacks on Americans without putting the Japanese Navy in immediate danger by getting too close to the American naval bases. The extremely long flight time of Zeros also convinced American intelligence that there were more Zeros in service than there actually were. The Zero was manned by a single pilot, had a wingspan of 39 feet, and a length from front to tail of about 29 feet. It had a moderate aspect ratio of 6.4. For weaponry, the Zero held two 7.7mm machine guns housed in the engine cowlings as its primary weapon system. For heavier firepower, the Zero also sported two 20mm cannons inside its wings. It is noted that the Japanese military classified 20mm ammunition as machine gun ammunition rather than cannon ammunition. The 20mm machine gun cannons were fixed in place, but they were flexible versions developed for the Mitsubishi Nell bomber. Although the Japanese Zero had superb flight range due to its lightweight and sleek design, the Zero was at a disadvantage when it came to ammunition capacity. For comparison, the Zero held a total of 120 rounds of 20mm ammunition, while the American Hellcat held up to 550 rounds of the same caliber ammo. For heavy ordnance, the Zero could carry two 130-pound bombs, or the Zero was sometimes given a singular 550-pound bomb. This 550-pound bomb was often delivered in an unconventional method, the legendary Kamikaze attack. With all the resources put into developing the Zero, it seems counterproductive to use the planes as an improvised missile delivery system. Many people think the Kamikaze dive was a last resort for Japanese pilots that ran out of ammunition or were too damaged to return to base. This is not the case. Japanese pilots often knew ahead of time that they were designated kamikaze flyers. The Japanese Navy needed a method to ensure that heavier bombs could score direct hits against the Americans. 550-pound bombs were loaded into Zeros, and certain pilots, often the less experienced and more expendable, would prepare for the final flight of their lives. Kamikaze pilots would hold special ceremonies before takeoff and would receive handmade gifts from thousands of women. One of the most famous kamikaze attacks, performed by 22-year-old Kiyoshi Ogawa in 1945, was performed with the express purpose of delivering his payload to the USS Bunker Hill. The bomb delivered by Ogawa would go on to kill 393 American sailors and disabled the Bunker Hill for the remainder of the war. Near the start of the war, the Zero was feared around the world, earning a recorded kill ratio of 12-to-1 in combat operations. The very first use of the Zero was on September 13, 1940, in a raid over Chongqing, China. During the raid, Japanese pilots were able to shoot down all 27 of the defending Chinese fighters, while the Chinese were unable to confirm any Zeros being shot down. A little over a year later, Americans would be introduced to the Zero in the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Soon, however, Allied forces developed tactics to exploit the weaknesses of the Zero. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights with Zeros, Allied pilots were instructed to swoop down on their enemy from a higher altitude, fire off a quick burst, and then disengage from the Zero. Because the Zero had such weak defenses, one heavy machine gun burst was often enough to bring down a Zero. Once the Allies started to adapt to the high speed of the Japanese aviators, many of the most experienced Zero pilots were killed in action. This created a steady decline in Japanese pilot quality, as replacement pilots often did not get to train as long before heading into battle. This ended up being one of the many factors that caused the Japanese to lose air superiority in the Pacific. As the Japanese continued to lose more pilots in reckless suicidal missions, more and more inexperienced pilots would be employed. These inexperienced pilots would be designated for kamikaze attacks, creating a vicious cycle that completely drained Japan of its skilled fighter pilots. Because the Zero was so weak defensively, it relied on the high speed and skill of veteran pilots to be truly effective. It can be said with certainty that the lack of skilled Zero pilots near the end of the war played a critical part in Japan losing air superiority in the Pacific. The Japanese Zero excelled in the areas it was meant to. It could fly longer and turn sharper than any other fighter plane in the world at the time. It was also still able to carry devastating ordnance that could sink key ships in the American fleet. Even still, there were some shortcomings with the Zero. Once these shortcomings were identified, America was able to adapt and eventually win the battle for the skies over the Pacific. Japan certainly instilled an extreme sense of devotion in its pilots, as it had done with its ground forces. But one could argue that this philosophy to war is one of the main reasons why Japan incurred such heavy losses. Through reckless tactics, Japan created for itself a shortage of skilled aviators that were needed to make the Zero more effective. As we will see throughout our analysis of Japan during the war, its sacrificial methods often resulted in poor outcomes for its war effort. We hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If there were any inaccuracies you noticed, don't hesitate to let us know in the comments. And as always, consider liking and subscribing, as we plan to increase our output of videos analyzing warfare throughout all of human history.